Welcome to Windows on the World. A great show for you tonight. And just before we get into that, tomorrow I will be uploading a great interview and a very informative one. The history of the so-called truth movement, how it was steered and what we can learn and how people can move on without getting dragged down into the same old circles. And that does, in a way, relate to what we're going to be talking about tonight. From skepticism to curiosity to a puzzle fitting so perfectly it aligns with every part of history, and exactly why what is happening in the present fits so perfectly with history. When the given narrative is fragmented, nonsensical, and doesn't explain anything, that's what our shows are all about. Clarifying anything which we can clarify, and also editing it down to something simple, because without that we're going to get into what that is. People say there's a mystery, and at this point it really doesn't matter if anyone believes it or not. It is helpful to know, and it is certainly extremely valuable in navigating the daily barrage of propaganda, which becomes laughable and inconsequential in the bigger scheme once we have certain information in place. The anxious insecurity of the many is of no consequence once the story is better known. Tonight we're going to be talking about Earth's early ages. When they say it's a mystery, well, I would respond, there is nothing mystical about the truth. Those who use the word mystery either don't know or don't want you to know. Archaeologists and geologists work within the parameters of what is accepted. Paleontology works in exactly the same way. The only way to come truly face to face with this is to either question accepted dogma or find something which does not fit the accepted story. It has been, of course, the wake-up call to many who have had their professional reputation destroyed when they found something which didn't fit, got excited about it, and then realised there was one narrative and there was one story, and theirs didn't fit. Earth's early history is still a mystery. In Chambers' journal dated February 1918, it states, "By what means the land surface of the globe has been broken up into its present form is another problem. The varied position of boulders, stones of all sizes from hundreds of tons to small pebbles is a geological puzzle to this day." And I've noticed this for many years. And we're going to be talking about this concept, this theory of the drift, and why it doesn't exactly fit. Well, of course, the Pangaea theory was also not accepted either. That was laughed at and ridiculed, yet subsequently it was found to be plausible, along, of course, with continental drift, the way that the Earth's plates actually move and are moving apart. The suggestion that mammals trapped in Siberian ice, a place which was previously warm and supporting much life, was brought about in a glacial age still abounds. It is still the major theory. However, mammals such as mammoths are found under boulder stones in Scotland. Ignatius Donnelly, in his book Ragnarok, on pages 49 to 51, states, "Animals were slaughtered outright, and so suddenly that few escaped. Drift fell as a sudden catastrophe. Stones and boulders alike are scattered through the clay. The drift marks probably the most awful convulsion and catastrophe that has ever fallen upon the globe. The deposit of these continental masses of clay, sand and gravel was but one of the features of the appalling event. However, geologists are unable to explain the drift age, except that it was caused by the action of ice. It is explained by movements of ice from the North Pole. However, it appears that the poles were reversed at some point. And that ties in to what we are going to be talking about this evening, what we have talked about in the past, and in our article Shattered Isles, we are talking about the work of William Comins Beaumont, the catastrophist, and we're going to be focusing on moving on from the last show we did on this subject, which was called The Mysterious Comet, also the name of a book written by William Comins Beaumont, published in 1932. But the time scale of this event, the drift, needs also to come under scrutiny. January the 18th, 1913, Dr. W.A. Sturge refers to a study in Sweden claiming overwhelming evidence of an ice age in Scandinavia, not more than 15,000 years ago, with a subsequent minor one about 5,000 years ago. Of course, these anomalies and findings are marginalised, so we have to look for them. In order to explain such findings, geology conjures up prolonged periods of glacial and interglacial periods. These are, again, theories in the respect that it is stated that they happened for very long periods of time and covered the whole Earth. To indicate the level of current interest, well, do an internet search of the drift age, and it comes up with nothing but an animated movie called Ice Age Continental Drift. This is how far we have fallen. The Wikipedia page is the only other source which repeats the consensus view of science. As with any search, we have to dig deeper. The theory which is avoided at all costs is an intervention from the skies, a huge comet which instigates the complete change, not over thousands of years but overnight. The idea that this event occurred in the north and spread out is actually backed up with much evidence. In The Mysterious Comet by Comins Beaumont, published in January 1932, he states, "It struck the highest mountains and the lowest valleys. From the direction of north-northeast rained a storm of the most devastating rocks and stones in a state of liquid fire. The huge body had undergone at least one helical contact with the sun." Of course, comets are usually drawn into the sun, which is where they disintegrate. But this doesn't always happen, as Comins Beaumont has outlined in The Mysterious Comet and his other books. And as somebody who was a meteorologist, one of the first people who came under this title, he gives example after example and evidence which is simply not there in the conventional world of science. So, the idea of this contradicts all these theories of an ice age or ice ages. Floods, a tilting Earth axis leading to a lowered Arctic Circle, is what he talks about. Previously, places even this far north as Britain had enjoyed a Mediterranean climate. Bodies of land were submerged by this event. The ocean deepened in many parts. In our show, The Mysterious Comet, we went into the background evidence and science of what became known as meteorism. Well, today, this means some kind of indigestion, according to internet searches. But this science was mainly down to the research of Comins Beaumont and later a few others. The impact around what is now the Isle of Staffa was deduced to be fairly recently by the calculation of Beaumont, the place of this catastrophe. He boldly stated with much detailed evidence that the comet struck on the 17th of March 1322 BC, splitting apart Scandinavia and Scotland and submerging a large area of land, leaving the Shetlands and Orkneys still visible. So all of this was one big landmass, which was submerged under the sea. Scotland was joined to Scandinavia. We know this because underneath that area is a place called Doggerland, which was inhabited. And Beaumont states this happened in a ghastly hurry. It had happened before, and at some point it will happen again. The survivors of this last cataclysm spread out into the Mediterranean, across Europe, and became the various civilizations which he describes in detail and with much evidence to back up his theory. Now, we only are able to go into superficial aspects and certain details in these radio shows, but After looking at his evidence, it is in fact quite overwhelming. And when one puts this in perspective with the other theories, history really does make sense. And what is happening now makes even more sense, which can only be a very useful thing. Let's talk about the Druids who gathered in oak groves and were divided and conquered by the Romans. They passed on their knowledge of the cataclysm orally to their descendants. The dolmens that we see all over Britain and Europe were built to be shelters and known only to those who would carry on after the next earth-changing event or cataclysm or mysterious comet. See our article, The Lost Order of Knowledge, at windowsontheworld.net. We are carrying on from our show, The Mysterious Comet, and that article. Well, let's quote Isaiah now from the Bible. He recommended hidden chambers until the Lord's anger had passed over. The vitrified forts, the stone melted by high temperatures in Argyllshire and along the line of the Caledonian Canal and locks, show evidence of these melted rocks. How were these rocks welded together? It must have been with absolutely intense heat. Well, Beaumont states the powerful blast from the comet came in the known path of comets from northeast to southwest, so the walls not facing these directions were not vitrified. Much is talked of relating lost land masses to Atlantis. See our show, Atlantis, Cataclysm. We did that quite recently. In Timaeus, Plato describes the drowning of Atlantis thus: there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of rain all your Athenian warlike men in a body sunk into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared and was sunk beneath the sea. Well, I'm not stating that this is the same event, but that this event could have happened, and this type of event has certainly happened before. However, in Critias, Plato explains things further, and I just want to get into that quote now. Okay, many great deluges have taken place, and in all ages and changes of things there has never been any settlement of the earth flowing down from the mountains as in other places, which is worth speaking of. It has always been carried round in a circle and has disappeared in the depths below. The consequence is that in comparison of what then was, there are remaining in small islets only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called. All the richer and softer parts of the soil have fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the country being left. Now that is a very interesting quote after what we've just said, isn't it? And Beaumont also goes into much detail how this event reshaped the landmass of the whole world. Let's go back into history, more recent history, and we can see that climate change has been an ongoing theme, and the idea of cataclysms is not out of the ordinary. In fact, it has been the way the earth has been shaped. But let's go back to the mysterious comet and quote from that. Page 264. In 1069, when William I was marching from Hexham to York, the snowdrifts and cold were perishing, and he lost most of his horses. In 1070, there was a great famine because of the lack of summers. Thus, for some 3.5 years after the comet had been seen, its malign effects were felt in icy winters. In 1099 occurred the catastrophe which destroyed the ancient Lyonesse. Just about 3.5 years later, in 1103, was a very calamitous year, there being murrain among the cattle and a deficiency of crops of every kind. The next great period was circa 1538, when the climate again became colder and damper. Now this is very interesting, isn't it? Because we have records of comets, and there's a very famous one in 500 AD, but when we're going back further, it's much more difficult, only because our grasp of history doesn't really go back that far. Let's have another quote more recently. This is page 262. If it be true that in the time of Caesar the Britons, or even the warriors among the Britons, dyed their bodies in woad and went naked, it is evident that the climate was infinitely warmer, for soldiers cannot fight if they are perishing with cold. Indeed, we are told in Charles Squire's investigating work that the ancient Gauls, about the time of the Roman conquest, lived and dressed much in the manner of the ancient Greeks. This, according to Myth of the British Isles, pages 25 to 27. And their manner of dress, as we are well aware, would more properly benefit the warmer latitudes of, say, Morocco or Tunisia than the northern shores of the Mediterranean today. In England, as late as the 10th and 11th centuries, the dress worn was very scanty, and both arms and legs were bare, which visualises a climate much warmer than it is now. As late as the Middle Ages, velvet, taffeta and silks were worn by the nobles without any underclothing whatever, while servants and serfs wore coarsely spun woolens, also minus underclothes. So later in the 1500s, after the warm period, things had begun to cool again. This is from the Holinshead Chronicles with woodcuts, and it was published in 1577, and it says, "There are old men yet dwelling in the village where I remain, which have noted the multitude of chimneys lately erected, whereas in their young days there were not above 2 or 3, if so many, in most uplandish highland towns of the realm. The religious houses and manor places of their lords always excepted, of course, but each made his fire against a reredos in the hall where he dined." And the writer does not stop at fires. He tells us that their fathers and the older men themselves slept on straw pallets with only the covering of a sheet under a coverlet. And one of the statutes of Edward VI, not so long before the vital year of 1538, ordained that no persons below the estate of a lord should wear a gown or mantle of a length below his buttocks. At that time, people did not wear over their legs more than a thin pair of knickers with light hose, or went frequently with bare legs. Here again is an example of either a milder climate or a Spartan fortitude among the populace, states Comins Beaumont. And we can also go on to the flora and fauna and the records that we do have, that there were many now extinct species from the warmer times is well known. There was a small kangaroo found in Wells, Somerset, and large fossils of lizards in Street near Glastonbury. The Mendips revealed mammoths, rhinoceros, lion, tiger, bear, hyena and wild horses. Recently, in 2020, in Somerset, the ichthyosaur, stated to be 250 to 90 million years old, was unearthed on a beach, the largest marine reptile ever found, allegedly. Now, the point is here that the dating is guesswork in these cases, and lots of assumptions are always forthcoming. I've been looking at this today, this particular case of this reptile, and it's all in line with the accepted doctrine of science. But layer upon layer of evidence is there. But of course it depends on who is looking for what. For instance, the level of Roman London is about 10 to 20 feet below the present surface level. In Roman London by Gordon Home, he states, "There is a great gap during which all traces of streets were obliterated under a vast accumulation of ruin and subsequent vegetable deposit." Comins Beaumont suggests this could have been the result of a tidal wave coming down the Thames. Even with today's Thames barrier, something of a magnitude of a tidal wave would never be held back, and London would once again flood. These events are scattered and not properly recorded or understood. What we're trying to get to here is that we are given a certain uniformitarian account of the earth, and when we start looking outside of it, we find it is exactly the opposite. We are in a very steady and safe interglacial period at the moment. But if something comes from above and it happens quickly, then everything, or nearly everything, and nearly everyone could be wiped out. So, we do have to look and pull out the evidence that we can find. But what is known is that sea levels did rise. Now, Polydore Virgil, in his history dated 1538, stated that the Isle of Man is now remote from the land by 23 miles, which in old times was 1 mile from Anglesey and joined onto Wales. Isn't that amazing when you think about it? Now have a look at a map and see what conclusions you might draw from that. Now, Beaumont then goes on about many of these raised beaches. On the island of Jura in the Hebrides, 6 or 7 of these raised beaches have been traced at various levels, the highest situated at 40 feet above present tide, the present high tide. The Isle of Man is said to bear traces of 5 such beaches. Any idea that the tides reached a height of 40 feet above high water today in some distant period by normal methods and then by a series of reductions formed layers of terraces may be dismissed, of course, as quite impracticable. Modern records show instances of raised beaches being formed by tidal waves, as for example in the case of the creation of Mont Nuovo in 1538, which was accompanied by a simultaneous and permanent raising of the sea beach at Pozzuoli, as also an earthquake, a fire, a muddy and black shower, ashes and lava, the death of birds and fishes were reported, the latter thrown up on the new formed beach. That's Lyell's Principles of Geology, page 326. There is evidence on the coastlines which can be seen today. The coastline beaches are sometimes narrow, and this is in Scotland, and sometimes expanding into broad and level terraces, as well as being narrow, as in the case of the raised beach on either side of the Moray Firth. Geologists recognise generally 3 raised beach systems in Scotland, indicating, so they say, successive shore levels during the Pleistocene period. In Norway, some of the raised beaches stand as high as 600 feet above the sea, and other parts of the world are beaches at a high elevation. And in regard to raised beaches of Jura, it should be said that Islay and Colonsay, all 3 south of Mull and Iona, possess these raised beaches, and they are situated, well, just south of a region which at some date must have experienced a most devastating event. So I hope you can see how all this ties together and what we're trying to do with this show. The enigma of raised beaches, some over 1,000 feet above mean sea level, is covered in The Mysterious Comet by Comyns Beaumont. Now we've also, of course, got very enigmatic scenes such as the Golspie Stone, which depicts a possible catastrophe and men and beasts running for cover. Now, I want to cover that more on another show because I've got a lot of information on that. And of course, in The Mysterious Comet, we covered the recent Tunguska impact. The Tunguska event, occasionally also called the Tunguska incident, was a large explosion of between 3 and 50 megatons that occurred near Tunguska River in Yeniseisk Governorate in Russia on the morning actually of 30th of June 1908. The explosion over the sparsely populated East Siberian range flattened an estimated 80 million trees over an area of 2,150 kilometres squared of forests, and eyewitness accounts suggest up to 3 people may have died. Now, there are witness evidence and statements of this. You can look them up. And the people were actually bewildered by what had happened, this huge explosion in the sky. The explosion, it says, according to Wikipedia, is generally attributed to a meteor airburst, the atmospheric explosion of a stony asteroid which was about 50 to 60 metres wide. The asteroid approached from the east-southeast, probably with a relatively high speed of about 27 kilometres per second, 60,000 miles per hour, that is. Though the incident is classified as an impact event, the object is thought to have exploded at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometres, 3 to 6 miles up in the air, rather than hitting the Earth's surface surface, leaving no impact crater. Now, this is incredible when you think about it, because if that happened and it didn't hit the Earth, can you imagine what would happen if something that size actually did hit the Earth? Well, have a think about that, and we'll have a little break, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. That was Dervel Gadon from the soundtrack of the Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs, which you can download on the homepage at windowsontheworld.net if you haven't done so already. A fascinating glimpse into the Reformation. And of course, we're talking about real history. It's hard to put that together. Just before the break, we were talking about the Tunguska incident, the largest impact event on Earth in recorded history, they say. Now we're trying to get to unrecorded history, or history that they don't want to be recorded. And so what we can conclude from this, what we were talking about there, if something larger actually hit the Earth, as appears to have happened, it would have radically changed not only the landmass, but everything on it, and also the weather. This is explained in great detail by Comins Beaumont. In fact, as I have searched his information, it seems to be scientific and theoretically sound. And the books, which I will give you the titles of towards the end of the show, are packed with information. I found his writing style quite difficult to start with, but once you get into it, you are being bombarded with facts and information, and it's quite hard to absorb it all. And one of the reasons why it's taken me quite a long time to get into this is because I was comparing it with other theories and other stories. And of course, he links this together very well with the flood, the Deucalion, the flood of Ogyges, how these legends and biblical events actually tie in to what he's talking about. So the biblical flood and Deucalion stories also do tie in perfectly with what is described. The only thing up for argument is when it all actually happened. Now, I'm just going to read out a summary from Thomas Pennant. This is called Tour of Scotland, page 278. 7 years before the end of the world, a deluge shall drown the nations. The sea at one tide shall cover Erin, and the green-clad Islay, but Columba's Isle shall swim above the flood. Confirming this prophecy, there are on the island remains of a standing circle called Clachabrath, and the stones of the world's end is the name of this circle. And Pennant, writing of his tour towards the end of the 18th century, when many relics now destroyed still remained, remember we're talking about quite a long time ago here, comparatively, and he says that they contained originally 3 globes of white marble. How fascinating is that? The ancient site of St Columba's Isle is located in Skeabost at the head of Loch Snizort, approximately 8 kilometres from Portree in Scotland. The site is a sacred burial ground and also a major ecclesiastical centre on the Isle of Skye, and was the seat of the Bishop of the Isles from the 10th to the 16th centuries. And according to tradition, 28 chiefs of the MacNichols or the Nicholsons lie buried in holy ground on St Columba's Isle. So when we go into the detail of Beaumont's theory, we are informed that the comet actually hit the landmass now known as Staffa. And of course, the Shetlands, the Hebrides were all part of this landmass which was submerged, and they are the remaining things that we can see. So we're talking about a very big landmass here. It's interesting in this connection to recall that Iona, for long ages before Christianity was adopted, was a sacred place, perhaps the most sacred site of the pagan, Caledonian or the Chaldee church, and like the Memphis of Egypt, says Beaumont, was the great burial city to which the bodies of the great were taken for interment. Now that is very interesting, isn't it? Because do you remember that MP John Smith was buried on Iona? So he must have been quite connected, or there must have been a symbolic reason why he was buried there, because not many people get to be buried on Iona. The tract, still called the Street of the Dead, testifies to the memory of this melancholy distinction, and there are said to have been no fewer than 64 kings buried in Railag Oran, besides many prominent chieftains and ecclesiastics. It is said that the kings and princes were influenced in their choice of this holy site, especially by a strange prophecy relating to the destruction of the world and the flood from which Iona would emerge unscathed. The words translated from the ancient Gaelic are actually in this book, and I've actually got them somewhere, but I'll try and check that out. Yes, we can go down and read that, and yes, we've just actually put it in, haven't we? That's great, because what I've done is I've managed to take the text from the photocopied versions of the book that I had, and I've actually sort of cut them out. So yes, we've done that. That's great. But now Ingrid McLean has sent me the actually reprinted PDFs, so things are going to be a lot easier when we do another show on this. She actually sent me them today because I didn't realise that they were all available, as I've got The Great Deception, but the others are the old kind of printed photocopied PDFs. So the Shattered Isles, the mystery of Britain and more are described in the books of Collins Beaumont. The Riddle of the Earth, 2025 was the first one. The Mysterious Comet, 1932, followed by The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain in 1945, and Britain, the Key to World History in 1948. And of course, The Great Deception, which was never published at the time, but has been published by resonantbookworks.com and is now available. And that is a very dense book which goes into the history of Britain as regards the transference of history, which we describe in Britain Shattered Isles. If you haven't looked at that, do look at it, because with this information, it's very dense and very detailed, and I like to go into it in very clear sections and do some comparison which will bring it out for you. So I hope you enjoyed that, and this is just really another in the series which we've done already on catastrophism. So also do subscribe to us on Odyssey and Spreaker, and I will be uploading some stuff to our Odyssey channel, which will also be on YouTube. And so with that, I would like to thank everybody who supports the show, and please do keep sending in information. It is part of this lifelong learning project, and it's very helpful to me, and it's very helpful to the listeners. And do support the show if you can. You can join the £5 a month club, which quite a few people have done, but we do need a few more. And the reason is I want to put out some more films and put more and more time into this. So do support the show. We're very marginalised on the internet because we say things that other people do not say. And we are not following the news cycle, and we're certainly not repeating or regurgitating what is already out there. So until the next show, stay in touch to the website, and thanks to everyone who supports us.